Hi there, and welcome to the Business of Story. I selected this tune called Scheming Weasel by Kevin MacLeod to open today's show in honor of our special guest, the self-proclaimed blog weasel and recalcitrant advertising curmudgeon, author of what I consider to be the finest newsletter on advertising called the Ad Contrarian, the one and thankfully only, God bless him, Bob Hoffman. I'm your host, Park Howell, and I'm so darn happy you're with us today. Why? Because we got Bob, and he calls it like he sees it, and few people, honestly, have the cojones to piss off as many people as he does by simply telling the truth about the advertising industry as he sees it, and believe me, Bob's seen a lot.
The question isn't, is storytelling good or not? The question is, how do you tell good stories? How do you evolve good stories? How do you make stories that real people are actually interested in? That's the hard part. It's like so much in creative fields, Park. It's like so much music is crappy. So many books are crappy. So many films are crappy. Like 7 out of 10 films never even get released, I think, if I remember right. Why? Not because people set out to do crappy films or write crappy TV shows or tell crappy stories. It's just that it's very, very hard to make good ones. Thinking that you're going to be successful just because you're telling a story, you're deluding yourself. You have to have good storytelling. You have to have a real story, and it has to be interesting to real people. That's the important part.
Bob's right. Storytelling is hard, and it's easy to be crappy at it. Let's face it, you're a business leader, sales genius, marketing guru, advertising savant, or content king and/or/queen. What most of you are not is a screenwriter. So toss out those complex Hollywood templates like the 17 steps of the hero's journey, Blake Snyder's 15 beats to story, or the 8 steps of the Pixar way, and begin your storytelling journey with these 3 words. And, but, therefore. We call it the ABT Foundational Narrative Framework. And I wished I had known about the ABT some 35 plus years ago when I started my branding and advertising career. Because I found that the ABT is where all powerful and persuasive business storytelling begins. It's how you take complex messaging and make it simple, concise, compelling, and most of all, unbelievably sellable. Learn the ABT and you've mastered the 3 forces of storytelling: agreement, contradiction, and consequence. Another way to think of these 3 acts to story is setup, problem, and resolution. This framework works because our primal cause and effect, pattern-seeking, decision-making limbic brain uses these 3 forces to make meaning out of the madness of being human beings. But you have to understand the magic to cast a spell. So take either of the ABTs of selling or the ABTs of branding quick online courses at businessofstory.thinkific.com. Or you can use the short code bit.ly/ABT courses. In under 30 minutes, you will begin putting this messaging dynamo to work for you. Because as Bob says, storytelling is hard. So make it easy on yourself by starting with the ABT at bit.ly/ABT courses. bit.ly/ABT courses. Now, on to Bob. As a grizzled veteran of the advertising front lines, Bob Hoffman has written 5 books about advertising, each of which has been an Amazon #1 seller. Bob is one of the most sought-after international speakers on advertising and marketing, having graced the stages in 24 countries, sharing his own lovably caustic insights on the advertising world. Hell, in 2021, he even braved COVID to speak to members of the British and European parliaments. Before leaving the advertising business, Bob had been the chief executive of 2 independent ad agencies and the U.S. operation of an international agency. Business Insider named Bob's blog, The Ad Contrarian, one of the world's most influential marketing and advertising blogs. And by the way, I highly recommend that you subscribe to it. He's not only really entertaining, but very insightful. And in fact, his commentary has appeared in the BBC World Service, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, MSNBC, and around the world. New Zealand Public Broadcasting, Canadian Public Broadcasting, Fox News, Forbes, you name it. He's been there. One of his books, Bad Men, How Advertising Went from a Minor Annoyance to a Major Menace, exposed many of the dangerous privacy abuse practices that have gone on to make international headlines. It was selected Best of Marketing 2017. I'm absolutely honored to host one of my favorite advertising writers of all time, Bob Hoffman, on the business of story. Have you always been an ad contrarian, as your world-famous newsletter speaks of?
I've always been kind of a contrarian throughout my life. I grew up in a family in which if you said something pretentious, you got withering looks, and you had to be real and down to earth. And if you tried to pretend you were above your station, so to speak, I learned at an early age to look for ways to stick pins in aristocrats and authoritarian figures. And it has stuck with me and served me very well in the advertising business, where so many people are full of shit, that it really has become a part of my constitution to be like this. Yeah.
Where did you grow up?
New York City.
Uh-huh.
Then I moved to San Francisco in the early to mid 70s. And I've lived here in the San Francisco Bay Area since then. I now live in Oakland, California.
I got you, and we're on Squadcast here, so folks can't see us, but I see that my screen just went off. And I want you to know that you are right now in an Elon Musk experiment, Bob Hoffman. I know you're a big fan of the muskrat, as you affectionately called him in your most recent newsletter. But I got a Starlink last week. I'm in northern Arizona, which is essentially a third world country when it comes to internet connectivity. And it only took me a year and a half of Elon having my $99, which I think he leveraged to buy Twitter. And I got my dish in, and so far it's pretty good, but it does have occasional dropouts.
Uh-huh. Well, I'm sorry if you're dropping out on me here, but I don't need to see you. I know what you look like, so no problem.
So what got you into the advertising business? I mean, you are a skeptic, you're kind of a contrarian to it, but you were a writer, an awarded a writer for many, many years.
Yeah, what got me into the advertising business was a chance occurrence. I was a teacher. I was a science teacher, and I hated being a science teacher. I was very, very bad at it. I had two problems. Number one, I don't know anything about science. And number two, I don't like children. Other than that, everything was fine. So anyway, I was the world's worst teacher, and I hated it. And one day, by chance, I ran into a friend of mine from college who I hadn't seen in a few years. And I asked him what he's doing, and he said he works in advertising. And I said, really? What does that mean? And he said, well, the commercials on TV? I said, yeah. He says, I write those. And it had never occurred to me that civilized people actually sat down and wrote those. Somehow they just appeared, I didn't realize that anyone intentionally sat down and wrote advertising. So he said, and I think you would be really good at that. I said, really? He said, yeah. I said, well, okay, tell me. I want to get out of this. I'm not good at what I'm doing. He said, and he helped me, what I needed to do. And I did what I needed to do. And I was kind of a bum. I was useless. And I was...
How old were you at this time?
I was about 25.
And still hanging out in New York?
Still hanging out at racetracks and pool room. I was a bum. And but this got my interest. And I went around and I got a job almost immediately. Well, the first job I got, actually, I decided I wanted to be a writer. Okay. So the first job I got was writing adult fiction, if you know what I mean.
Hmm.
And that was
And
in Greenwich
is this
Village.
purely from experience that you were
And
harking on?
no, that was the problem. See, that was the problem. I worked at it for one day and then I quit because after the first day, I ran out of everything I knew about
I
it.
was going to say, you got to write what you know, right?
Yeah, and I was lost. So I did it for one day and that was it. But then I got a legitimate job writing, and I did that for 2 years. I worked for Panasonic, the electronics company in New York City. And then I moved out to California and got a job in an agency and worked there for many where I started as like a junior copywriter and worked my way up to CEO of the agency. And then we got bought by an international agency, and I worked for them for a few years. And then I left there and just did freelance creative work for about 3 years. And then I went back in the agency business. And that's my story in the agency world. Yeah.
Well, Bob, as a hardcore skeptic contrarian from New York, making your
Yeah.
way out to the Bay Area, that had to have been a
Yeah.
bit of a transition for you.
It was. It was a culture shock for me. Californians seemed so nice. And compared to what I was used to in New York, and they didn't really work very hard. I used to say I did more work in a lunch hour in New York than I did all week in San Francisco. But, over time that changed, and San Francisco, you know, became a hardcore advertising town and did some really good advertising for many years. But still, the culture was very different out here than it was back there, and it still is substantially different, I think.
So you have made a really remarkable living. After your career is over, you got out of the advertising business, and now you are
Yep.
this really iconoclast in poking holes in all things advertising. When you were writing this stuff, do you ever look back at some of your own work and said, man, you were just as full of shit as what you're calling out of these people in your newsletters?
Absolutely. Absolutely. To survive in the agency business, you almost have to be full of shit because the clients expect certain that you have certain beliefs, and you have to pretend that you believe it even if you don't. Particularly for me, the hardest part was when I became CEO of I was CEO of 3 agencies. And the hardest part of that was I had people working for me who relied on me to provide an income to them by having clients. And as a result, I had to be very careful what I said to clients. A lot of the clients I had to deal with were morons, and I couldn't tell them that what they are trying to do is all wrong because I would have been fired. I mean, the agency would have been fired, and I wouldn't have lost my job, but 10 or 20 other people would have lost their jobs. And these people had homes and cars and children and mortgages. And so I had to do a lot of pretending. And, I'm not really good at pretending, but I did my best. But the freedom of being outside the agency business and not having a lot of people reliant on me, where if I say something stupid or obnoxious, the only one who pays is me, that freed me up to say what I really think because I don't really care if people like me or not. And I don't really care if people want to do business with me or not. Fortunately, I'm in a position where I don't give a shit. And it's a lovely position to be in.
Well, it is. I mean, I've been after you for about, 3 months to get you on the show, and you've been traveling around the world speaking and so forth. And then you sent me a note last week and you said, Park, went to your website, lovely show, listened to a few things, but I'm not really interested. I'm retired. I'm not interested in making money. And I promised you would make absolutely no money by being on my show. So I appreciate your honesty there. But I got to ask too, I bet
Yeah.
you probably get an inquiry a week of someone that wants you to take over their account.
No, I
No?
don't. No, I get no. At first, when I first retired, a lot of people wanted me to consult. Agencies and marketers wanted me to consult, and I did it a couple of times, and I hated it. It First of all, it's a lot of work for very little money. I can make more money doing a half-hour talk than I can doing 3 months or 2 months of consulting. So, what the hell do I need that for? And second of all, I found that they don't really want my opinion, they want my approval. Okay. So I would do consulting, and I would, when I get done, I'd tell them what I thought, and they'd be disappointed because I didn't approve of the plan that they had. See, because they came into it already with an idea about what they wanted to do about their problem. They just wanted me to confirm their brilliance. And so I gave, after like 2 or 3 gigs, I said, this ain't for me. I'm not going to do it anymore. So I don't do that. And people wanting me to take their accounts, I'm not in the advertising. I can't make advertising anymore. I can't go back to that. It's like once you get out of jail, you're not going to volunteer to go back into jail. I'm sorry. So, I escaped with my life, and I like it that way. And I'm not going to be doing any advertising work for anyone. I have, I, I have plenty of opinions, but I don't have the guts to get back and do it because it's just too painful. Yeah.
It is too painful. And for me,
Yeah.
anyways, I mean, you and I have been at this a long time. You, I think, a little bit longer than me.
I'm sure.
But it just seems like the creativity has been absolutely sucked out of advertising with the advent of digital marketing. And
Yeah.
now they think it's a numbers game. And you had said something, and I don't know if it was your quote or you attribute it to someone, but it's one of my favorite all-time ones. And I think
Hmm.
you had said, when I saw you speak at a Nashville conference of, again, Michael Gass's Fuel Lines program, you said
Yeah.
you were more likely to graduate from Navy SEAL training than click on a banner ad.
Yep. That was me.
I
And
love that.
and yeah, there's the click rates on online advertising are so tiny. They generally, now nobody can agree on anything the online metrics was supposed to give us perfect information about who's doing what. It has had the exact opposite effect. Nobody agrees on anything. But if you look at the general consensus, people believe about 5 ads are clicked on for every 10,000 ads that run. This means so if you're online and you're seeing all these ads and you wonder why the hell are why are all these ads here? Because you have to run 10,000 ads to get 5 people to click. Then you're not even getting 5 real clicks because at least 30% of the clicks are phony. They're bots or something. So you're probably getting 3 actual clicks for 10,000 ads that you run.
Well, you've done the math for us in one of your newsletters called the Programmatic Poop Funnel,
Yep.
which, I mean, you pretty much spells it out here to the point of you are just literally pissing away your advertising money in the poop funnel.
Yeah, the programmatic ad ecosystem, as it's called, is a freaking joke. It is so corrupt. It is so inefficient that I have calculated. Now, I'm no mathematician and I'm not a statistician.
And not a
All I have,
science teacher, we've
and
learned.
I'm not. Yeah, I'm a blog weasel. But I haven't had anyone. Thousands of people have seen the programmatic poop funnel, and not one has challenged the math of it. And the math of it says that for every advertising dollar you spend in the programmatic online advertising ecosystem, you get about 3 cents worth of real people seeing real ads. That is astounding, but people keep doing it anyway. I don't.
Hmm.
I get. If people keep asking me, Bob, marketers aren't stupid. Why do they keep? Yes, they are stupid. They're very fucking stupid. Why else would you do that? Don't tell me they're not stupid. I worked with them for 40 years. Don't tell me they're not stupid. I know they're stupid.
The one thing about following you and reading your stuff, not only does it make
Yeah,
me laugh, but sometimes I feel
yeah,
very self-conscious, like, oh shit, he's
yeah.
calling me out. I've made
Yes,
I've made that same
yes,
mistake, and I've believed my own hyperbole,
yes. And so have I. Believe me, I'm not innocent of this. I'm a just when I was in the agency business and I had clients, I was just as big a bullshit artist as anyone else. I am not innocent of anything.
You said in a recent post that I really found interesting is the one that triggered me to finally reach out to you, because I didn't have the guts to do it for a few years because I thought, oh my
Yeah.
God, he's just going to tear me apart on my own show. Uh, but it was the one that you wrote about brand meaning is kind of BS. I mean, it's got some import to it, but what it really is about is being famous, that you
Yes.
have to get your message out there. And so in reading your stuff, you actually make our lives way easier because we can stop thinking that we are these like beautiful social scientists hacking through the ideal, customer persona, and the belief that we are Carl Jung and truly understand what is driving these people, when what do they really want? They want ease. They don't want to get COVID. They want to make more money. They want to do less work. And the brand that is most famous in those areas are the ones that they're probably going to go to.
Right. In marketing and advertising, there are no there's no true and false. There's no black and white. There's no right and wrong. There's just likelihoods and probabilities. Okay. And the likelihood is that in virtually every category that you can think of, the most successful brands are the most famous brands. And what advertising can do best, and the first job of advertising should always be to create fame. Fame has an incredible value, not just to brands, not just to products, but to human beings. Why am I on your podcast here today when there are 5,000 people who are smarter than me about advertising? Because in our own silly little world, I've become famous. And how did Donald Trump become president? Because he was famous. If The Apprentice had been a webinar, do you think he would have become president? No way. But The Apprentice was on TV for 14 years. He became famous, and as a result, he wound up being president. The fame is an unmatched advantage. If your brand is famous, you have so much leverage against other brands in your category that are not famous. Along with fame goes several other attributes. People feel comfortable with you if you're famous. People feel like they can trust a brand that is famous. And they may not realize it, they may not think of it in those terms, but that's how people actually behave. And the same is true of people. If some jerk calls you up and wants to have lunch with you and talk to you about something, you don't pay it. But if someone famous calls you up, you're going to take that call. You're going to have lunch with him. You're going to want him or her on your board. You're going to want him or her as an advisor. And it's just an amazing advantage to be famous, and we don't realize it. Fame isn't esoteric enough for us in the advertising and marketing business. We have to pretend that, in order to charge the rates that we charge for what we do, we have to make it seem as if we have certain double secret mysterious knowledge that the person who's hiring us doesn't have, and you're paying for that double secret, you know arcane knowledge that we have. And it's just not true. Advertising is not that confusing. It's not that complicated, but we we take the obvious and make it incomprehensible with all the bullshit we contrive and all the jargon we throw out. And it's really not necessary. If I were your boss, if you were working for me, if you were my advertising agency, I would give you a 3-word brief. I'd call you into my office and say, make us famous. If you can do that, I can do the rest.
How do you make a brand famous?
There are several ways. You can make a brand famous. You can have a CEO who's good copy that the press loves to talk to, a Steve Jobs. You could have, or an Elon Musk. Tesla got famous without spending a nickel in advertising. Why? Because the press fell in love with Tesla. Elon Musk is great copy. He's always saying something outrageous that sells newspapers and is good for TV
And you got to
news.
argue he delivers.
And he delivers. You can get famous by having a really superior product. Google did that. Google had introduced a search engine that was far superior to anything else. They became famous for that. You can become famous with great public relations. If you do public relations really well, if you do stunts really well, you can become famous. The most expensive way to become famous, but the most reliable, is advertising. Because advertising, you can buy your way into fame. Okay? None of the other, you can't rely on your CEO to be good copy. Most of them are, a pain in the ass and no one wants to talk to them, or they're dull. You can't rely on PR. Sometimes it hits, sometimes it doesn't. You can't rely on the press falling in love with you. They fall in love with 1 out of 1,000 companies and give you free, Facebook and Tesla, companies like that got millions of dollars of free press every day of the year. You couldn't open the business section without reading about Facebook and Tesla at the beginning, and Google too. So there are a number of ways to become famous. But like I said, advertising is the most reliable, but the most expensive.
Well, and to quote you, you had once said, advertising is like fertilizer. Everywhere you throw it, it does a little good.
Yes. I stole that from, who is the guy? He was so funny. Oh, yeah. Oh my God, I can't remember. I'll think of his name and I'll send it to you. Pat McCormick, his name was. He used to be a writer for Johnny Carson. He was a comedy writer. Very funny guy.
Pat McCormick. Bob, have you read one of my favorite business memoirs is Phil Knight's Shoe Dog? And it was a book that was given to me, and it was not something that I would ever buy or read normally because I'm not a huge Nike fan. Number one, their shoes don't fit my skinny, tall falling arch feet very well. But it was a really brilliant memoir, and he talked about, when they were basically going out of business every month for about 10 years. You only think of Nike as this big monolithic brand.
Right.
And he said, it was belief that really got them through. When people didn't know who they were not famous, but when they would go in and, sell them on their waffle-soled shoes and that it was better for runners, that their belief sold that brand. And then, of course, they got Wayne Kennedy on board and they threw tons and tons of money at it, and they became famous through, I think, a combination of certainly, buying ad space, spending billions on it, but also having really great creative and storytelling that did have a way that I believe created meaning around this particular product that, was just another commodity, but was different in the shoe world.
Some brands are able to do that where there's a certain group of people who are very attached to the brand. Now, we all have our favorite brands. Mostly we work on automatic pilot.
What's your favorite brand?
Probably Apple.
Apple? And why is that?
I would guess. Because I've been using their products
for there's Jobs right now calling you.
Yeah, that's I've been using their products for 100 years, and I'm satisfied with their products. And they have done a good job of creating a nice feeling about the brand too. But they are 2 to 3 standard deviations from normal. Most brands are commodities or appear to be commodities to consumers. Watch people shopping and you can see they know, I know what brand of tuna fish I'm going to buy. I just go, it's automatic pilot. I go and buy. I know what brand of jelly I'm going to buy. It's automatic pilot. I know what soda I like. It's automatic pilot. They don't do careful analysis of every product they buy every time they buy something. They go in and they know what they want pretty much. Every now and then something shakes them up. But for the most part, brands are not nearly as important to consumers as we marketers would like them to be. And if you stop some people on the street and you ask them, what's the difference between Mercedes-Benz and BMW? They go, I don't know. What's the difference between Nike and Adidas? I don't know. Nike has the check thing, the swoosh thing. It's the difference between McDonald's and Burger King. McDonald's has the arches, and that's all. That's pretty much all they know. Meanwhile, if you go into those companies, you go in their marketing departments, read their strategy documents. Oh, this means this, and that means that, and consumers believe this, and consumers believe that. And it's all baloney. You go ask consumers, they don't know. They recognize a few symbols, maybe a melody, a logo, colors, those kind of things. The brand don't have those deep meanings to us that the marketing and advertising communities believe they do. And that's why it's so hard to differentiate products. I mean, every product in the world, every brand in the world thinks their product is differentiated from the other guy. If you go into a Coca-Cola headquarters and you read their marketing strategy documents, you'd think Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola are completely different things. You read what Coke thinks their strategy and what their brand meaning is, and you read what Pepsi thinks their brand. Then you go out in the street and you ask, what's the difference between Coke and Pepsi? I don't know. The Coke, the bottle is like different, or Coke has that ribbon thing. That's all people know. But we have to invent these fantasies to keep ourselves busy, I guess.
It seems to me, I'm a huge Apple fan too, of course. I spend the premium on all my Apple gear.
Yeah.
But it does seem like their brand messaging really took a dive when Jobs died. They just seem to be more boring than ever.
It's not as good as it was. And Steve was very assiduous about one thing in his advertising.
Assiduous? I'm not sure I even know what assiduous means.
Look it up, my friend. The advertising that he approved, the product was always front and center. It was always right in the middle of the page, right in the middle of the billboard, right in the middle of the TV spot. It was about the product. Now, there was one exception to that, and that's that brilliant campaign they did, Here's to the Crazy Ones, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's when they really introduced the Think Different campaign.
Right. That lasted about, I think, 12 or 18 months. That didn't last long. And then back to really focused on what the product does, and in ways that were specific. Like when they introduced the iPod, the most marketers would introduce the iPod in very big term, the greatest music player in the history of the world. But Apple, no, very specific. 1,000 songs in your pocket, right? Specific and about the product. And Steve believe me, I know people who worked for him on advertising and worked with him on it. He was a total pain in the ass, but he knew what he wanted and he was usually right.
Did you know Lee Clow?
I didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of that work, I would imagine, is really the teamwork between Steve Jobs and Lee Clow, who was in the agency Chiat.
Yep.
And that was really, to me, kind of the last bastion of brilliant advertising work, because then along came the digital world, and it just seemed like it swallowed up creativity and storytelling.
So I know you love storytelling. I'll tell you a story about Steve Jobs and Lee Clow, okay? So one day, they used to have these marketing communications meetings every 2 weeks or so, where people from Chiat would fly up and they'd meet with Steve and his marketing people, and they'd have meetings and talk about stuff. So one day, Lee brings up the new head of planning. They hired one of these English guy planners. And,
now, wait a minute, English guy planner, because he had the accent, so he carried more weight?
Yeah. Well, there was a period where all the planners were they were all English. They all came from Great Britain, and they had the accent, and they were very impressive. Anyway, the guy, again, he's going to give an overview of the Apple brand and me and planning thing. And so he gets up and he starts talking. After about 5 minutes, Steve puts his head down on the conference room table as if, he's taking a nap, his head in his arms. And the guy starts to panic, but he keeps talking. He keeps his cool, he keeps talking. And he talks for another 2 or 3 minutes. Steve lifts his head up and he goes, "Stop." And he turns around and he says, "Lee, am I paying for this bullshit?" And I know this story because a good friend of mine was at that meeting. Yeah.
Who does Steve Jobs look to for strategy? I mean, That's good. Well, let's talk about storytelling a little bit. It's become a bit of a rage out there, and there's a lot of quote unquote storytelling gurus out there. And quite honestly, I found it because I was so dismayed. I was running my own ad agency here in Phoenix. I started in 95. I ran it for 20 years, Bob. I really liked it for 10 years. And we were still doing traditional advertising. It was radio, print, outdoor, direct mail, public relations, events, that kind of stuff. There was no Yelp. The digital world came along, and quite honestly, I was struggling trying to figure out what the hell is this, and how is it going to really make a difference, and how is it going to completely upset our world, which it did. And I never really found anything about the digital world that I liked as it related to the advertising that I grew up on. I fell in love with advertising with Rainier beer commercials in Seattle, Washington. I don't know if you're familiar with those crazy campaigns, but they were beautiful.
I did advertising for Rainier.
Did you really? The running of the Rainiers?
I didn't do the good stuff, but I did advertising for them.
Mickey Rooney and the running of the Rainiers, and they did just the craziest stuff. But I loved it because it really played to the theater of the mind. And I will tell you, my most favorite part of my entire career is when I was a young, starving copywriter, and I was working for this guy by the name of Sandy Peterson, and we did these local radio commercials for these crazy clients that would allow us to do anything. And I would write and produce just these wackiest commercials, so much so that some of the general managers said we had to pull them off their station because they were out there and whatever. And they really, really worked. And I had no idea what I was doing at the time, Bob. I was just kind of making it up as I went, but they were all story-based. So let's fast forward 20 years. And when I realized that our advertising and marketing wasn't working anymore because this whole digital disruption, I went looking for some answers. And I went to Hollywood and saw what the hero's journey and this sort of thing. And it, to me, from a branding standpoint, it made a lot of sense. Instead of just throwing a bunch of crap out there in the digital world, to go back to creating meaning through funny, interesting, weird storytelling that actually cuts through the clutter. And so then I wrapped up my agency after 20 years and said, screw it, I'm out of here. I'm focusing solely on helping companies and leaders connect again with the people sitting across from them by actually using story structure in their communications. And so I want to throw it out to you. What do you make of this trend, this movement around storytelling and branding, advertising, and marketing?
Well, let's start at the beginning. There are two lineages of advertising. There are two genealogies of advertising. There's the direct response lineage and there's the brand lineage. The direct response lineage started with, clip this coupon, and then it became dial this 800 number, and then it became click here now. And then there is the brand lineage, which is not about trying to get someone to do something immediately, but trying to get someone to become familiar with and appreciate certain products and brands. And that's the lineage that all the great brands have been built on. Coca-Cola and McDonald's and Toyota and Nike and Adidas and Coke and Pepsi. And so when online advertising came in, who knew what it was going to be? Was it going to be the direct response lineage? Buy this now? Or is it going to be the brand building lineage of Coke and Pepsi and McDonald's and Nike? And it turned out to be the direct response lineage because of the supposed benefits of tracking and personalized one-to-one advertising. And that's the way it has evolved. Now, that kind of advertising is not conducive to storytelling, because what that kind of advertising is offer based. It's like, buy this now, save 20%, that kind of stuff. The brand kind of advertising is conducive to storytelling and should be done in a manner that emulates storytelling. The problem is that storytelling is way, way, way harder than people think it is.
Yeah.
That's why most books do not become bestsellers, because the stories aren't as good as the authors think they are. And that's the trouble with business storytelling, is that the stories are usually either self-serving or boring or uninteresting, and maybe 3 out of 100 are really stories that average people are interested in. And that's why it's so important that people like you are around to help people make stories that are interesting. Because if left to their own devices, they'll tell stories that nobody gives a shit about except themselves. And so the question isn't, is storytelling good or not? The question is, how do you tell good stories? How do you evolve good stories? How do you make stories that real people are actually interested in? That's the hard part. It's like so much in creative fields, Park. It's like so much music is crappy. So many books are crappy. So many films are crappy. Like 7 out of 10 films never even get released, I think, if I remember right. Why? Not because people set out to do crappy films or write crappy TV shows or tell crappy stories. It's just that it's very, very hard to make good ones. That's the hard part. Thinking that you're going to be successful just because you're telling a story, you're deluding yourself. You have to have good storytelling. You have to have a real story, and it has to be interesting to real people. That's the important part.
And Bob, you've made a career, of course, of writing, and then now what you're doing with your books and your speaking and your newsletter, you have a very decided voice that you write in, and you are quite a good storyteller. Much of it feels very natural. I don't feel like you have a schematic down and like filling in the blanks to write your stories. What do you think, or what advice would you give to writers to say, here are some of the basic blocking and tackling you have to do to tell a good story about yourself, about your brand, about whatever it is you're trying to get someone to buy into?
Well, the first thing is talent. You have to be honest with yourself and say, do I have the talent to write good stories or not? And if you don't, then you have to find someone who does. Next, the stories have to be not self-serving. the reason I think that I am successful at what I'm doing is that I very rarely inject myself into what I'm writing about. When I'm doing self promotion, then I do it, but I do it with tongue in cheek. I do it in a way that I'm making it obvious that I'm not writing self serving things here, but that I understand that what I'm doing is self promotion.
Hence the moniker Blog Weasel.
Blog weasel, right? Exactly. If you can't make fun of yourself, then you have no right to make fun of anyone else. And the main thing above all else is talent. There are not that many people who are good at storytelling. And if you don't have the talent for it, acknowledge it and find someone who can tell your story better than you can. Because my good friend George Tannenbaum says good writing is a business advantage, and he's certainly right about that. And particularly if you're going to try and be in the business of storytelling, you have to do it well, or it will not help.
Well, it's the idea, too, of not only executing on a story, but actually having the bigger vision or strategy around a story, knowing that you need to have a story. Somehow we need to do a better job of communicating the narrative about this brand. If, again, in your two lineages, we are trying to build some fame around the brand so that our direct response stuff will be even more powerful. It's so often, and you talked about working with numbskulls, and I think we've all been there,
Yeah.
that they don't even appreciate the fact that they don't have a clear narrative for their brand that anybody cares about.
You know what the problem is, Park? Is that everything is a story. There is nothing that humans do that isn't a story. And consequently, it's very hard for us to understand not what a story is, but what an interesting story is. The Wall Street Journal every day takes the dullest numbers in the world and turns them into stories. And it's just pages of pages, mostly of numbers, that each one could be a story. But you have to decide what story you're going to tell. And is it interesting? And does it represent you well? And are you telling it well? It's not easy.
And it has to come from the point of view of your reader, does it not? Again, that self-serving thing, if you just all about me, who cares?
Right. And it also helps if it happens to be true. that also is a helping thing.
A bit of a benefit. If it's not true, it's going to get found out eventually, isn't it?
Yeah.
Finally, the last little topic I'd like to cover with you, if you got a few more minutes, Bob, is this idea of, by golly, we really need to get in the heads of Gen Z and millennials because they are going to be the people that are showing up with the deep, deep, deep pockets that are going to make our brand successful and cool and hip and trendy. When it really comes down to a quote I saw somewhere, and I'm going to misquote it now, that you pulled that said, when anything goes down, always look for the 50-year-old to foot the bill for it. So
PJ O'Rourke said that. He says anytime anything happens, someone over 50 pays for it. and he's absolutely right. And, the facts speak for themselves. 96% of all the wealth in this country is owned by people over 42 years old. And yet, somewhere between 5 and 10% of marketing and advertising activity is aimed at those people. And it's completely absurd. It's beyond absurd. I mean, if people over 50 in the US were their own country, they would be the third largest economy in the world. People over 50 in the US are a larger economy than the entire economies of India, Japan, and Germany. And yet, people over 50 are mostly ignored by the marketing industry, except for they are viewed as a series of diseases that need remediation. And it's completely absurd. And it's driven by the youth culture of the advertising and marketing industry. People over 50 represent 6% of the advertising industry population. 6%. And they represent about 49% of the total population. So the whole, 47%, I'm not sure. The whole thing is absurd, but it is marketing by selfie stick. You have 28-year-olds in advertising agencies thinking that everyone is like them, and they're marketing to people like that. They have no idea what a 60-year-old is like, and the 60-year-olds have like 5 times as much money as any 28-year-old and spend it freely. Over 50% of all consumer spending is done by people over 50. But we're living in a fantasy land where marketers are only interested in young people. I mean, it's absurd. The car industry is completely absurd. 57% of all cars are bought by people over 50, and there's no advertising targeted at them. Everyone in a car ad is under 30. The whole thing is stupid, and I've been writing and talking about this for 10 years, and nothing changes. It's the same. We've had the same legends and rituals in the advertising industry for 30 or 40 years, aiming everything at everyone who's 18 to 34 years old. And it's ridiculous. It's just stupid. It makes no sense, but we continue to do it because that's how we've always done it.
What's interesting about that is, so I'm 61, so I fall in that
Yep.
category of ignore me
Yep.
at all costs on your
Yep.
advertising. We've got kids 39, 35, and 28,
Mm-hmm.
and none of them are big consumers. They've
Yeah.
got the money. They
Yep.
don't really care to go and have a fancy car. They
Yep.
love going and buying their stuff from thrift stores and whatever. They don't buy the latest trends at all. They just don't care about it. They spend their money on activities and
Yep.
trips and doing things like that.
Experiences. Yeah.
Experiences. But and we're the ones that are buying them all their stuff for Christmas. Like, man, that coat's pretty beat up. Let me get you another coat for Christmas, for crying out loud. They just don't care. They
Yeah.
just aren't big consumers out there.
Well, the advertising industry is probably the greatest demographic change in the history of humanity. We're right in the middle of right now. In 1950, there were 3 times as many people under the age of 5 as there were over the age of 65. By 2050, there will be twice as many people over the age of 65 as there will be under the age of 5. This is worldwide. Unbelievable change in demographics in just 100 years, and the advertising industry has no clue about it, pays no attention to it, couldn't care less. Marketers the same way. They're in this fantasy land where if they advertise to 18-year-olds, when they're 40 and ready to buy a new car, they'll remember the ad from when they were 18-year. I mean, what's the ROI on that? On showing an ad to an 18-year-old because he's going to buy it when he's 45.
I buy my Rainier beer because of my 18-year-old exposure.
Yeah. And that's one of the interesting things, though, that you can't completely ignore young people either. You have to be sensible in how you spend and target your advertising dollars. And that's why mass market advertising is so important. Because as you just said, why are you buying Rainier beer now? It's not because of the Rainier beer ad you saw 2 weeks ago. It's for the Rainier beer ads you've seen for 25 or 30 years. So you have to do, in my opinion, mass marketing so that everyone sees you and you become famous. And that's how you build a strong, brilliant brand.
Well, I'm glad you're here with us today. We're going to find out just a minute where people can learn more about you, Bob, so that you can become even more famous.
Even more famous.
Exactly.
At your expense, yes.
At my expense, because this really is a hobby of mine. I'm making zero money on this podcast as well, I might add.
Yeah, you make as much money on your podcast as I make on my books.
Well, you know
Zero.
what? Well, you know what? I get a chance to talk to really fun, interesting, cool people like you. And if I didn't have a podcast, I'd have no excuse, and you wouldn't pick up your phone because I'm not famous either.
But yeah, and I write my book so Jeff Bezos could make a lot of money. That's my contribution to society.
Well, you've got 5 really funny, interesting, insightful books that you raise as your own children, because I know I've written a couple of my own books. And the question is, of these 5 books, Advertising for Skeptics, Laughing in Advertising, Bad Men, How Advertising Went from Minor Annoyance to a Major Menace, which is probably the best subhead I've read in a long time for a book. Marketers Are from Mars, Consumers Are from New Jersey, and finally, 101 Contrarian Ideas About Advertising. Of those 5 books, if nobody has ever heard about you and we are now making you famous, which is the book you would direct a listener to first?
Well, from the standpoint of which one I think is most important, I would go with Bad Men, because Bad Men tells the story about how the online tracking industry is doing terrible damage to our society. But from the standpoint of which one I think offers the most interesting points of view on advertising, I think I would go with Advertising for Skeptics.
And that's your recent one, isn't it?
Yes, that's my most recent one. I have a new one coming out soon. I hope it's soon. I'm in the middle of it right now. It's called Plain Talk About Advertising, and I hope it'll be done fairly soon.
All right, Bob, where can people find your books, find out more about you, and subscribe to your newsletter, which I highly, highly recommend. It's the most fun you'll ever have reading a newsletter about advertising.
The easiest way to do all those things is to go to my website, which is called bobhoffmanswebsite.com. And if you go there, you will find links where you can see the books, and you can subscribe to the newsletter, and you can send me nasty notes, and anything you want to do, you can do there.
I love the fact that I could send you an email and call you a blog weasel in it. I thought that was pretty cool. Bob, any final parting shots before we sign off today?
No, just a thank you for having me on your podcast, and a thank you to all the people who took the time to listen. And I hope this was helpful or informative or entertaining.
Well, thank you, Bob. It was all those things. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you all listening to this edition of The Business of Story. If you are unfamiliar with Bob, you got to go and check out his work, and by all means, share this episode with your friends, family, colleagues, or any young person remotely thinking about getting in the advertising business. They should really take it to heart of, is that really where they want to go? And check out his books. They are such fun read, but they're insightful at the same time. So, please share it all with your friends and family and colleagues out there. If I can be of help to you, come on over to The Business of Story. Well, I can help you craft and tell compelling stories that actually sell. And until next week, when we will have another amazing story artist right here, like the blog weasel Bob Hoffman, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is a story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks so much for listening.
We out.